In the mid-18th century, the Indian subcontinent was a treasure chest of spices, silks, and jewels, lusted after by the empires of Europe. The British East India Company, a corporate entity with its own army, was sinking its teeth deep into the flesh of Bengal, the richest province of the decaying Mughal Empire. Calcutta, a swampy fishing village transformed into a bustling port, was the heart of British power in the region. At its center stood Fort William, a monument to British arrogance. Its cannons pointed not just out to sea, but inward towards the land they occupied. In the spring of 1756, a new power rose in Bengal, Siraj Daulah, a young, proud, and volatile Nawab. He saw the British not as traders, but as a venomous snake coiling in his garden, and he was determined to crush it before it could strike. The final insults were a litany of defiance. The British were strengthening Fort William's fortifications without permission, abusing their trade privileges, and worst of all, giving sanctuary to one of the Nawab's enemies. For Siraj Daulah, this was an intolerable challenge to his sovereignty. The order was given, and an army 50,000 strong began to march. Elephants, cavalry, and foot soldiers armed with muskets and tulwars moved like a great, suffocating wave towards the British settlement, a force of righteous fury aimed at the heart of the company. Within Calcutta, Governor Roger Drake and his council dismissed the warnings with colonial hubris. They believed their fort was impregnable and their soldiers superior, a fatal miscalculation that would cost hundreds of lives. The Nawab's army first crushed the British outpost at Cossimbazar, a swift and brutal prelude to the main assault. The garrison was overwhelmed, a grim omen of what awaited the defenders of Calcutta. News of the disaster at Cossimbazar finally shattered the complacency in Fort William. Panic, like a fever, began to spread through the British community. Merchants who had boasted of their security now frantically tried to secure passage on ships, while the native population of the city fled in droves, sensing the impending slaughter. The city's pulse quickened with a frantic, desperate energy, the air thick with the stench of fear. On the 16th of June, the Nawab's vanguard appeared before Calcutta. The siege began not with a grand assault, but with a creeping terror. His forces set fire to the outlying villages and markets, creating a ring of fire and smoke that slowly tightened around the fort. The defenders watched from the ramparts as their world burned, the inferno casting a hellish glow upon their pale, frightened faces. The defense of the fort was a chaotic and poorly managed affair. Governor Drake, the man in charge, proved to be a coward of the highest order. The initial attacks probed the British defenses, revealing them to be brittle and disorganized. Artillery duels echoed through the smoke-filled air, but the sheer numbers of the Nawab's army made the British position feel like a small island in a raging, unstoppable sea. As the situation grew more desperate, the ultimate betrayal occurred. Governor Drake, along with the senior military commander and several council members, abandoned their posts. Under the cover of darkness, they secretly fled to the ships anchored in the Hooghly River, leaving the remaining garrison and civilians to their fate. Their escape was an act of craven self-preservation that sealed the doom of Fort William. With the leadership gone, command fell to a civilian, a surgeon named John Zephaniah Holwell. He was a man of some standing but no real military experience, now tasked with commanding a demoralized and leaderless garrison. He found himself the captain of a sinking ship, surrounded by frightened soldiers, crying women, and the ever-present thunder of the Nawab's cannons. The responsibility was immense, the hope for survival almost non-existent. For 2 more days, Holwell and his makeshift command fought on, a desperate last stand against overwhelming odds. The fort's walls were crumbling under constant bombardment, and ammunition was running dangerously low. The air was thick with the metallic smell of blood and the acrid smoke of gunpowder. Each hour brought more death, each cannon blast a tremor of finality that shook the very foundations of their courage. The end came on the 20th of June. With the enemy pouring through breaches in the walls and his men exhausted and outnumbered, Holwell knew further resistance was a suicidal act of madness. He ordered a white flag of truce to be raised, a stark symbol of surrender against the smoke-blackened sky. The firing slowly died down, replaced by an eerie, terrifying silence pregnant with uncertainty. Siraj ad-Daulah entered the conquered fort in triumph. He strode through the courtyard, stepping over the bodies of the fallen, a victor surveying his prize. He was reportedly furious to find that Governor Drake, the man he held personally responsible, had escaped his grasp. His anger, initially directed at the leadership, would soon turn its unforgiving gaze upon the unfortunate souls left behind. Holwell was brought before the Nawab, who assured him and his fellow prisoners that no harm would come to them. It was a promise that would prove to be utterly worthless. As dusk began to fall, the Nawab left the fort, leaving the fate of the prisoners in the hands of his lower-ranking officers. This single act of delegation, whether born of indifference or malice, set the stage for the horror to come. The Nawab's soldiers, celebrating their victory, began to round up the remaining British survivors. The initial number is a point of great historical debate, but according to Holwell's account, there were 146 prisoners. They were men, and one woman, Mary Carey, from all walks of life, soldiers, writers, merchants, all now reduced to the same level of terrified captives, their lives hanging by a thread. The guards were faced with a problem: where to secure such a large number of prisoners for the night. They searched the fort for a suitable lockup, their torches cutting through the deepening gloom. Their search ended at a small, unassuming chamber that had been used by the British as a military lockup for drunk and disorderly soldiers. It was known simply as the Black Hole. The room was a cube of brick and mortar, a space measuring a mere 18 feet by 14 feet. It was designed to hold perhaps 2 or 3 men at most. It had only 2 small, barred windows, high up on the wall, offering almost no ventilation in the crushing, humid heat of a Bengal summer night. To suggest confining over 100 people in such a space was not a plan for imprisonment. It was a death sentence. The prisoners, initially believing they were being led to separate quarters, began to realize the horrifying truth as they were funneled into a narrow corridor. The soldiers, armed with clubs and the flats of their swords, began to brutally force the captives towards the single, dark doorway. Cries of protest and confusion were met with blows and curses, the casual cruelty of men who saw their prisoners as less than human. The sheer horror of the situation dawned on them. They were being forced into a space that could not possibly hold them all. The front of the crowd was pushed in, while the back was beaten forward. A wave of panic and desperation surged through the group. They resisted, they pleaded, they fought back, but the press of bodies and the guards' relentless violence were too much to overcome. The first men were thrown inside, stumbling into the suffocating darkness. Then more followed, pushed and crammed on top of them until the small room was a solid mass of human flesh. The air was instantly hot and foul, thick with the stench of sweat and fear. The door, a heavy slab of timber, was then slammed shut, the sound of the iron bolt sliding into place a thunderclap of doom that extinguished the last flicker of hope. The first hour was a struggle for space, a frantic, desperate battle just to breathe. Men were pressed so tightly together they were held upright, even as some began to faint from the heat and lack of oxygen. The room became a vertical coffin, the living and the unconscious crushed together in an inseparable, sweating mass. The heat, generated by over 100 bodies in a sealed room, was already becoming unbearable. Holwell, positioned near one of the small windows, tried to maintain order, but it was a futile effort. A desperate, animalistic thirst began to take hold. The prisoners' throats were parched, their bodies rapidly dehydrating in the oven-like conditions. Cries for water, first as pleas and then as agonizing screams, filled the darkness. Jal, Jal, the Bengali word for water, became a maddening, repetitive chorus of the damned. One of the guards, an old man, seemed to take some pity on their suffering. He ordered water to be brought, but the method of delivery was an act of profound cruelty. The water was passed through the bars in skin bags, too large to fit through the opening. The prisoners, now half insane with thirst, fought like rabid animals to get a few precious drops, spilling most of it onto the floor in the frantic struggle. This small act of mercy backfired horribly, transforming the desperate prisoners into a frenzied mob. Those at the back, far from the windows, trampled over the weaker men in a maddened surge to reach the water. The cell erupted into a vortex of violence. Men bit, clawed, and gouged at each other, their humanity stripped away by a primal, all-consuming thirst. The first deaths were not from suffocation, but from being crushed and trampled underfoot. As the night wore on, the air became poison. It was thick with carbon dioxide, the stench of sweat, urine, and the sickly sweet smell of death. Men began to succumb to asphyxiation, their lungs burning for oxygen that wasn't there. They died silently, standing up, held in place by the press of bodies around them. The living were packed so tightly with the dead that it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. Delirium began to set in. The unbearable heat, the toxic air, and the extreme dehydration caused hallucinations and madness. Men screamed at imaginary demons, fought with ghosts, and spoke to loved ones who were thousands of miles away. The black hole was no longer just a physical prison. It had become a psychological torture chamber, a madhouse where the boundaries between the living and the dead, reality and nightmare, completely dissolved. Holwell, clinging to life near the window, made a desperate offer to the guards. He promised them 1,000 rupees if they would move the prisoners to a larger room. The guards took the message to their commander, but soon returned with a chilling reply. The Nawab was asleep, and no one dared to wake him. The prisoner's fate was sealed by the slumber of a single man. By midnight, the noise began to subside. The screams and pleas were replaced by the soft, gurgling sounds of men dying from suffocation. The pile of bodies on the floor grew higher as those who lost consciousness were no longer supported by the crowd and collapsed. Those still alive found themselves standing on a shifting, gruesome platform of their dead and dying comrades. Holwell survived by a grim stroke of luck and sheer willpower. He found a spot near the window where a faint current of air could be felt. To keep his mouth moist, he resorted to sucking the sweat from his own shirt sleeves. It was a disgusting, desperate act of survival that demonstrated the depths of degradation to which the prisoners had been driven in their final, agonizing hours. The only woman among them, Mary Carey, reportedly survived the initial crush, but eventually succumbed to the horror. Her story is a particularly tragic footnote in the greater catastrophe. She was trapped in the same hell as the men, suffering the same agonies, her presence a stark reminder that the tragedy did not discriminate. Her death was just one of many, but it stands out as a symbol of innocence lost in the brutal chaos. One officer, Captain Clayton, remained lucid and steadfast for hours, offering words of encouragement to the men around him. He spoke of honor and duty, trying to maintain a shred of military discipline in the face of absolute chaos. But even his strong will was eventually broken by the toxic air and crushing despair. His final words were a delirious prayer before he collapsed into the mass of bodies. The guards outside were not entirely oblivious to the horror. They were seen holding their torches up to the bars, peering in with a morbid curiosity. They laughed at the delirious ravings of the dying men, treating the unfolding mass death as a form of grotesque entertainment. Their cruelty was not born of direct orders, but of a profound and chilling indifference to the suffering of their enemies. As the hours crawled by, the pile of the dead in the center of the room grew to be several feet high. Those still alive were forced to the edges of the cell, standing on the sloping mound of their former colleagues. The physical contact with the dead, their cooling flesh and lifeless weight, was a constant, horrifying reminder of their own impending fate. The floor had become a soft, unstable carpet of death. The concept of time dissolved. There was only the darkness, the heat, the thirst, and the ever-present stench of death. Each breath was a painful, labored effort, a desperate fight against the inevitable. For those who remained conscious, it was a slow, terrifying process of watching and feeling their own bodies shut down, their minds fraying at the edges as they slipped towards the same fate as their comrades. By 4 in the morning, a profound silence had fallen over the black hole. The desperate struggles had ceased, the delirious cries had faded away. There was only the sound of a few ragged, shallow breaths. The great majority of the prisoners were now dead, their bodies contorted in the final agonies of suffocation. The cell had become a silent, packed tomb. Around 6 in the morning, as the first light of dawn began to pierce the darkness, an order was heard from outside. The Nawab had finally awoken, and upon being told of the prisoner's plight, commanded that the door be opened immediately. For the few who were still conscious, the sound of the bolt being drawn back was not a sound of salvation, but a noise from another world. The door could not be fully opened. It was blocked by the pile of corpses that had slumped against it during the night. The guards had to physically pull the dead bodies out of the way, one by one, to clear a path. They dragged the stiffened, discolored corpses out into the corridor, their limbs locked in unnatural positions, their faces frozen in expressions of terror and agony. Then the survivors emerged. According to Holwell, only 23 of the 146 who had entered the cell walked out alive. They were more like ghosts than men, stumbling into the daylight, their skin pale and clammy, their eyes wide with the horrors they had witnessed. They were skeletons draped in rags, barely able to stand, their bodies and minds scarred forever. Holwell was one of the last to be brought out, so weak he had to be carried. He was laid on the grass of the courtyard, where he gasped for fresh air, his lungs burning. The world seemed surreal, the green of the grass and the blue of the sky an impossible contrast to the black, suffocating hell he had just escaped. He had survived, but he was a broken man, the living chronicler of a nightmare. When Siraj ad-Daulah was shown the mountain of corpses, his reaction is debated. Some accounts say he showed no remorse, while others claim he was horrified by the unintended massacre. He had wanted to punish the British, to humiliate them, but it is unlikely he explicitly ordered a mass execution by suffocation. The tragedy was more likely a result of negligence and casual cruelty at the hands of his subordinates. The bodies of the 123 victims were unceremoniously disposed of. They were thrown into a ditch that had been dug for the fort's defenses and covered with earth. There was no funeral, no last rites, no dignity in their burial. They were simply erased, their final resting place an unmarked mass grave, a testament to the brutal finality of the event. The few survivors, including Holwell, were not freed. They were paraded through the streets of the Nawab's capital, Murshidabad, in chains as trophies of his victory. They were subjected to the jeers and contempt of the populace, a final humiliation after their unimaginable ordeal. Their survival was not a reprieve, but an extension of their suffering. News of the fall of Calcutta and the horror of the Black Hole eventually reached the British settlement in Madras. The story, particularly as told by Holwell in his dramatic and widely circulated account, caused an explosion of fury and outrage. The tale of suffering and death was transformed into a potent instrument of propaganda, a justification for unparalleled vengeance. The man chosen to lead the expedition of revenge was Lieutenant Colonel Robert Clive. He was an ambitious, ruthless, and brilliant military commander, a man who perfectly embodied the predatory spirit of the East India Company. The Black Hole was not just a tragedy to be mourned. For Clive, it was a golden opportunity, a moral blank check to wage a war of conquest and retribution. Clive's forces arrived in Bengal with a singular purpose: to retake Calcutta and to make the Nawab pay 100 times over for the lives lost in the Black Hole. His campaign was swift and brutal. He easily recaptured the city, but that was not enough. He was determined to destroy Siraj Daulah and seize control of Bengal for the company. The story of the Black Hole became a powerful recruiting tool and a source of righteous fury for the British soldiers. They fought with a particular ferocity, believing they were avenging their murdered countrymen. The memory of the 123 dead was invoked before battles, transforming the conflict from a colonial war into a holy crusade against a supposedly barbaric and treacherous enemy. Clive, a master of intrigue as well as warfare, engaged in a conspiracy to overthrow the Nawab. He secretly made a deal with Mir Jafar, one of Siraj Daulah's most powerful generals, promising to make him the new Nawab in exchange for his betrayal on the battlefield. The fate of Bengal would be decided not just by bullets, but by treachery. The decisive confrontation came at the Battle of Plassey in June 1757, almost exactly a year after the tragedy in Calcutta. Clive's small army of 3,000 faced the Nawab's massive force of 50,000. On paper, it should have been a slaughter, but Clive was counting on his secret weapon, betrayal. As the battle raged, Mir Jafar and his large contingent of the army stood idle, refusing to engage the British as promised. This act of betrayal caused confusion and panic in the Nawab's ranks. A sudden, torrential downpour soaked the Nawab's gunpowder, rendering much of his artillery useless, while the British had protected theirs with tarpaulins. Fate, it seemed, was on Clive's side. The battle turned into a rout. Siraj Daulah, realizing he had been betrayed, fled the battlefield in a desperate attempt to save his life. His army, leaderless and demoralized, collapsed completely. Clive had won a stunning, decisive victory, one that would hand the immense wealth of Bengal over to the East India Company and lay the foundation for the British Raj. The young Nawab's flight was short-lived. He was captured, dragged back to his capital, and executed by the agents of Mir Jafar, the man who had betrayed him. His death was ignominious and brutal, a grim end for the ruler who had dared to challenge the power of the British. With his death, the last real obstacle to British domination in Bengal was removed. Mir Jafar was installed as the puppet Nawab, but the true power now resided with Robert Clive and the East India Company. They plundered the Bengali treasury, an act of corporate looting on an unimaginable scale that crippled the local economy and led to widespread famine. The revenge for the Black Hole was complete, and its price was the subjugation and exploitation of an entire nation. For the next 2 centuries, the story of the Black Hole of Calcutta was a cornerstone of British imperial ideology. It was taught to schoolchildren as a tale of British heroism and Indian savagery. It served as a perpetual justification for British rule, a reminder of the supposed barbarism that the civilizing hand of the empire was there to suppress. However, in the 20th century, historians began to critically re-examine the event, particularly Holwell's account. Holwell, as a survivor and the primary narrator, had every reason to exaggerate the numbers and the horror to maximize the impact of his story and to portray himself as a hero. His narrative, for so long accepted as fact, was put under the microscope of historical scrutiny. The central point of contention is the number of prisoners. Modern analysis of the cell's dimensions suggests that physically cramming 146 adults inside would have been nearly impossible. Many historians now believe the true number of prisoners was likely closer to 60, with around 40 fatalities. While still a horrific tragedy, this revised figure challenges the scale of the massacre as presented by Holwell. This historical revisionism does not absolve the perpetrators of their guilt. The act of forcing dozens of people into a tiny, unventilated room in the dead of a tropical summer was an act of murderous negligence, regardless of the final body count. The suffering of those who died was absolute. The debate over numbers does not diminish the horror, it merely seeks a more accurate understanding of the event. The Black Hole of Calcutta remains a deeply contested and painful memory in the history of British India. For one side, it is a symbol of native treachery and barbarism, a justification for empire. For the other, it is an example of colonial arrogance leading to a tragedy that was then cynically exploited to justify conquest and plunder. The truth, as is often the case, is a complex and brutal shade of grey. Today, at the site of the old Fort William in modern-day Kolkata, a memorial stands. It is a quiet, somber place, often overlooked in the hustle of the bustling city. It marks the spot of an almost unimaginable horror, a night when a small room became a microcosm of hell on earth, an event whose echoes of cruelty, revenge, and propaganda still reverberate through the corridors of history. The Siege of Calcutta was a brutal affair, marked by moments of intense, close-quarters fighting. Before the final surrender, the Nawab's troops launched several probing attacks against the fort's outer defenses. The British and their locally recruited sepoys fought back from behind earthen ramparts, the air filled with the screams of the wounded and the deafening roar of musket volleys exchanged at point-blank range. The Nawab's artillery, though numerous, was often poorly served and inaccurate. However, the sheer volume of fire had a terrifying psychological effect on the defenders. The constant bombardment, the whistle of cannonballs overhead, and the explosion of stone and splintered wood from the fort's walls created an environment of perpetual, nerve-shredding stress. Sleep was impossible, and every moment was lived on the edge of death. When Governor Drake and the other leaders fled, they left behind not only the garrison, but also their families. The women and children were huddled in the safest parts of the fort, their terror mounting with every cannon shot. Their abandonment by their own leaders was a particularly cruel betrayal, leaving them at the mercy of a conquering army with no one to negotiate for their safety. Before the surrender, a final, desperate council of war was held by Holwell and the remaining officers. They gathered in a smoke-filled room, their faces illuminated by a single lantern, their uniforms torn and filthy. They debated their options: a suicidal last stand, an attempt to fight their way out, or surrender. The exhaustion and despair on their faces told the story. There was only one choice left. The moment of surrender was one of profound humiliation. The surviving defenders laid down their arms before the Nawab's victorious soldiers. The British flags were torn down from the ramparts and trampled into the dirt. For the soldiers of the East India Company, who were raised on a creed of their own superiority, this act of submission was a deeply psychological blow, a shattering of their world order. As the prisoners were being rounded up, looting began in earnest. The Nawab's soldiers, celebrating their victory, rampaged through the fort, breaking into storerooms and private quarters. They were searching for treasure, wine, and anything of value. This breakdown of discipline contributed to the chaotic atmosphere that would lead to the tragedy of the Black Hole. The decision to use the Black Hole was likely made by a low-ranking officer on the spot, without consulting the Nawab. It was a decision born of convenience, impatience, and a complete disregard for the prisoners' lives. The guards, eager to finish their duties and join the celebrations, saw the small cell as the quickest way to deal with their captives, a fatal shortcut with catastrophic consequences. Inside the cell, the social hierarchy of the British prisoners dissolved almost instantly. Officers were crushed against common soldiers, wealthy merchants against lowly clerks. The shared experience of extreme suffering was a brutal equalizer. In the suffocating darkness, rank, wealth, and status became meaningless. There were only dying bodies, desperate for one more breath of air. The two small windows were the focal points of the entire prison. They were portals to a world of open space and breathable air, a world the prisoners were brutally denied. Men fought and died for a position near them, a chance to press their face against the bars and gasp a lungful of air that wasn't poison. The windows represented a hope that was both tantalizingly close and impossibly far away. One of the most horrifying aspects of the ordeal was the noise. For hours, the cell was filled with a cacophony of human suffering, screams of pain, desperate prayers, the gurgling sounds of suffocation, and the mad ravings of the delirious. For the guards outside, and for the survivors within, this symphony of death would be a sound that haunted their memories for the rest of their lives. Some prisoners, in their final moments of delirium, believed they were drowning. The sensation of their lungs filling with fluid, combined with the intense pressure of the crowd and the sweat-soaked environment, created a powerful hallucination of being submerged. Men were heard gasping about rising tides and cold water, their minds creating a more merciful death than the slow, hot reality of suffocation. By the middle of the night, the floor of the prison was slick with a gruesome mixture of sweat, urine, and the fluid expelled from the lungs of the dying. The survivors had to stand in this filth, the stench adding another layer to the sensory hell. This utter degradation was a core part of the experience, a complete stripping away of not just life, but of all human dignity. The emotional toll on the survivors was catastrophic. For years after, they suffered from what we would now recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder. They were haunted by nightmares, plagued by guilt for having survived when so many others perished, and tormented by the memory of the things they saw and did in that suffocating darkness. They had escaped the black hole, but in many ways, they never truly left it. When Clive's army retook Fort William, they found the black hole. The soldiers were reportedly brought to the site and shown the tiny room where their countrymen had died. This act was a powerful piece of psychological warfare, designed to instill in them a burning hatred for the enemy and a desire for bloody vengeance. The cell itself became a dark shrine, a physical embodiment of their casus belli. The East India Company, in its official reports, seized upon Holwell's account and amplified it. The story was meticulously crafted to portray the British as innocent victims and the Nawab as a monstrous tyrant. Any mention of the company's own provocations or the chaotic nature of the fort's fall was conveniently omitted. History was being written by the victors, and it was a story written in blood and ink. The wealth plundered from Bengal after the Battle of Plassey was so immense it directly funded Britain's industrial revolution. The revenge for the Black Hole had far-reaching consequences, fueling the engine of an empire that would dominate the globe. The deaths of a few dozen men in a Calcutta prison cell became, through a brutal chain of events, a catalyst for a new era of global power and economic exploitation. Even today, the term Black Hole of Calcutta is used in English to describe any cramped, unpleasant, and suffocating space. Most people who use the phrase are unaware of its dark and bloody origin. The memory of the actual event has been bleached of its horror, reduced to a common idiom, a ghost of a tragedy that has become detached from the unimaginable suffering that gave it birth. The physical structure of the black hole itself no longer exists. It was demolished in the 19th century, and its exact location is a matter of some debate among historians. Like the precise details of the event itself, the physical evidence has vanished, leaving only accounts, memorials, and the long, dark shadow it cast over the history of two nations. The initial resistance from the prisoners as they were forced towards the cell was fierce but futile. Men drew pocket knives or used their bare fists to strike at the guards, a last, desperate act of defiance. But they were unarmed, weak from the siege, and hopelessly outnumbered. Each act of resistance was met with a brutal blow from a club or musket butt, quickly crushing their spirit. As the first bodies began to fall, a new kind of horror emerged. The prisoners had to make a grim choice, either stand on the bodies of their comrades or be trampled themselves. This desecration of the dead was not an act of malice, but a necessity for survival. It was a profound psychological trauma, forcing living men to use the dead as a literal stepping stone to stay alive for a few more minutes. The heat inside the cell became so intense that men stripped off their heavy woolen and cotton clothing in a desperate attempt to cool down. The floor was soon littered with discarded shirts, coats, and breeches, adding to the filth and chaos. By the end, the prisoners were a mass of nearly naked, sweating bodies, their pale skin glistening in the dark, their civilized appearances completely stripped away. Among the prisoners were several high-ranking members of the East India Company's council. These were men of power and privilege, accustomed to giving orders and living in luxury. In the Black Hole, they died just as miserably as the lowest-ranking soldier. Their wealth and status offered them no protection from asphyxiation, a brutal lesson in the absolute democracy of death. Thirst drove some men to lick the moisture that condensed on the cold stone walls, but this offered no real relief and only increased their suffering. Others, in their madness, tried to drink their own urine, a final, desperate act that signaled the complete collapse of reason and the overwhelming power of the body's primal need for water. The cell became a laboratory of human endurance pushed far beyond its limits. For the survivors, the moment the door was opened was one of both relief and profound horror. They had to climb over the stiffened bodies of their friends and colleagues to get out. Every step towards freedom was a step on a dead man. This final, gruesome act ensured that the memory of their escape would be forever intertwined with the desecration of the fallen. The immediate aftermath for the survivors was a medical nightmare. They suffered from severe dehydration, heat stroke, and psychological shock. Their bodies were covered in bruises and sores from the crush. Holwell, a surgeon himself, knew that their ordeal was not over. They now faced the difficult and painful road to recovery, a journey many of them were too weak to complete. The story of the Black Hole served as a cautionary tale for the British in India for generations. It fostered a deep-seated paranoia and a justification for racial segregation and mistrust. The memory of the event was used to rationalize the creation of separate, fortified British cantonments and a social order built on the principle of keeping the native population at a safe and suspicious distance. Siraj ud-Daulah's decision to leave the prisoners in the hands of his subordinates was a fatal error in judgment. As Nawab, he bore the ultimate responsibility for the actions of his men. Whether the massacre was intentional or a horrific accident, it happened under his command, and in the world of power politics, that was all that mattered. His failure to control his own victorious army cost him his throne and his life. The legacy of the event is one of brutal irony. Siraj ud-Daulah attacked Calcutta to curb the growing power of the East India Company and assert his sovereignty. Instead, his victory and the subsequent tragedy of the Black Hole provided his enemies with the perfect excuse to destroy him, seize his kingdom, and establish a permanent, unchallengeable dominance that would eventually grow into an empire.